Welcome to Transcendent. I'm Raya, and I'm the daughter.
And I'm Joe, and I'm the dad.
If you're listening to us on Monday, this is an important day. It's October 6th. It is the beginning of the new term for the Supreme Court. This is the day that they hold their long conference to consider appeals, and they will also hear oral arguments in their first cases for the term. We're going to be talking about that here today, right after this.
We're here with Jim Santelle. He is an attorney and a former prosecutor who served as a U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Wisconsin from 2010 to 2015. And what I really like is that he is really an expert on some of the most significant news stories in the areas of government operation, delivery of justice, and application of rule of law principles. And I have learned a lot from Jim as we've talked especially about LGBTQ issues and many of the cases that have happened. So, Jim, welcome.
I am delighted and honored to be with both of you and to share what you just said, which is some exposition, some interfaces between what's going on in America, around the world, some basic news events, trying to understand them through the lens of some civics and even some constitutional law. I promise we won't turn this into a law school, but some understanding about how things work. And through that mechanism, hopefully providing some information that your listeners will embrace as they go out and articulate their views about the world.
Our listenership is, of course, international. We will be talking specifically about legal issues today in the United States, because I think many of the eyeballs in the world around are looking to us right now and what we are doing. So most of our listeners are here, but for those of you that are not, this will still be relevant for you as well. Tell us a little bit about how you got into this in particular.
Sure.
And the focus on LGBTQ issues and what drew you to that.
So I was an assistant United States attorney for most of my career with the U.S. Department of Justice. I had the great pleasure and honor once again of being appointed by a president named Barack Obama to serve as the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Wisconsin. And in that administration, and I should say also, hasten to add that in prior administrations, both Republican and Democratic, there was a focus on civil and human rights. And when I was an assistant U.S. attorney doing civil cases, also doing criminal cases, that emphasis coming from what's called Main Justice, but also coming from other U.S. attorneys, not only attracted me, but made me think that this is what a Department of Justice should be all about. My boss was Eric Holder. I also worked with him, and he was a Deputy Attorney General for Janet Reno. And he always said the temperature of a Department of Justice, the way in which you understand what this agency does, is always taken through the Civil Rights Division. If you've got an active and important and vital Civil Rights Division protecting the human rights, the civil rights of all Americans, you know your Department of Justice is doing good things. I was attracted to that and continue to have that attractive feature about me even since leaving the office.
Jim, there is a lot going on right now in the government regarding LGBTQ issues. Right. A lot. And some are good and some are not. Right. And there's a lot happening every day, it seems like.
Right.
Tell us a little bit more about that. What kind of things do you see that are creating a lot of pressure for the LGBTQ plus community?
Right. You know, the big decision coming out of the Supreme Court that I thought a year or so ago was going to be the single most important case, and it still is right up there, is the Scrimeti matter, in which legislatures in this country passed laws, again by a majority, not without great dissent inside their legislative bodies, basically prohibiting healthcare providers, prohibiting doctors and medical officials from providing healthcare, medicine, to people undergoing transition, youth in particular, right? And so the legislatures come along and they say, we are going to prohibit that as a matter of law in our states, and we are even going to criminalize that if healthcare providers provide youths, again, under 18, with any sort of medical treatment, including puberty blockers and other treatments like that. It goes up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, through the pen of John Roberts, that this is a complicated issue, which it arguably is, but says this should be a matter for the state legislatures to decide, and we're not going to do it. They're better situated than we are to make that decision. And so basically punts back to the states, but along the way says, yes, indeed, legislatures can do this. You can, in fact, restrict medical care. Obviously, parental involvement is huge. Decision-making is huge. Deciding what you want to do, again, with your own body, as we've always talked about that when it comes to privacy rights and civil rights. Supreme Court dealt a blow, I believe, to civil rights, human rights in America in deciding the Scrimeti case in the way that it was. We know that there are about 20 other states out there that are doing the same things, and it gives license not only to do the similar things, but sends a message to others out there, legislative and other groups out there, who might be encouraged by this statement from the Supreme Court. That, I think, is a matter for everyone to be hugely concerned about. I am hugely troubled by it. I don't think it's the right decision. I don't think it gives proper sense and importance to the individual's decision, the family decision, obviously youth decisions and parents, and instead permits legislators to make decisions for people that should be within the family.
So we have people, listeners on both sides of the aisle to this podcast, which we're very grateful for because we're trying to help bridge that gap. Many of our listeners may be wondering, why did the legislature make that decision to begin with? And many on the other side may be saying, and what's so wrong with that decision?
Right.
You know, I'm worried about kids, and I think that it's
Absolutely.
bad to be giving them medical treatments before they're ready for it. Why is that, in your opinion, a bad decision?
And you have identified exactly what the Supreme Court said about this and exactly what the legislature said about this. The Supreme Court actually looks to a number of studies, frankly, in Europe and other places. It raises just these issues, that the transgender medical support and concerns. You do have medical people who are writing an awful lot of articles out there in all directions. And I can't even tell you whether it's balanced or not, what the percentages would be. But John Roberts basically looks at this and says exactly what you just identified, which is he does say it's an evolving area. It's not yet certain. We cannot decide this with the kind of medical certainty that we've decided cases in the past. And for that reason, we're going to let the legislatures decide this. And that is something that all your listeners, regardless of where you are on these issues, can embrace, that notion that legislatures should represent the people. The particular legislatures in these particular states looked to those studies that talked about harms and hurtfulness, when in fact there are medical treatments that are provided to youth, and decided that based upon those medical studies that this is something that, as the representative of the people in that state, we need to restrict and we need to impose. There are those folks in those states, those medical providers, who object to that strongly and say that's what we are here for to do, to engage with the families, make those assessments, and also give them the right to decide what kinds of medical support. There are those folks who say, no, this is a very clear and bright line test. And so, to the benefit of this very good broadcast, that's the kind of thing that everybody should wrestle with.
What other types of LGBTQ plus rights are in danger?
We've got a couple of things coming up in this present term of the Supreme Court, and we know what those are. They've been much in the news, and they've also been very controversial, right, out there, both in America and around the globe. One of them is transgender sports, transgender women in men's sports. That issue is being percolated up. It's before the Supreme Court. They're taking right now briefs from the attorneys on whether or not, once again, the states can restrict transgender women from playing in male sports.
Are we talking primarily high school sports? Are we talking college sports? Are we talking professional? I mean, what kind of authority do they have?
They're focusing specifically on Title IX, right, which is the one that especially applies to colleges, but it could have implications far beyond that.
You say transgender women, by which you mean someone like me who was assigned male at birth, transitioned, was on hormones, and is now playing women's sports with women.
Right. This is the concern, that how do you define the issue and how far does it go, right?
Yes, that's correct. There are issues there. But there are not issues with transgender men.
Again, depending upon how you define the issue, there are possibilities in both directions. So, for example, when you look at things coming out of the District of Idaho, U.S. District Court, this is the Ninth Circuit, saying that it violates the Equal Protection Clause, discriminates on the basis of transgender status and sex when you are making these kinds of limitations. And so it is actually both. So you've got Lindsay Hecox, a transgender woman who is trying out for the Boise State high school varsity teams and not being permitted to play on women's sports.
It's really a fight between transgender women on the one hand feeling like, well, this needs to be fair for us. We need to still be able to participate somewhere.
Absolutely.
And on the other hand, skeptics saying, well, but it needs to be fair for cisgender women. And that seems like it's unfair to have a male-bodied person who just because they've transitioned doesn't take away the advantages that they have in that body.
Right.
And then on the other side, on the trans side, folks coming back and saying, actually, hormones change you quite a bit.
Yes.
And then I think for someone like me, I think nobody would object to me being in any sport because they're not going to want me on their team.
Right. For various reasons, right? Exactly. Goes to the particular person, right?
Anybody an advantage at all.
Right. And what you've just described actually identifies the issue. And we think once again that maybe the Supreme Court, as it has done in the case involving transgender care for youth, that Scrimeti case, you're going to get a huge number of what are called amicus briefs. And those are friend of the court briefs where you're going to have medical people, probably on both sides of the issue, articulating exactly what you just said, which is, I believe that, in fact, this is unfair just because you've got, once again, ultimately a male body who's now participating in women's sports. On the other side, those medical authorities saying, no, hormones do in fact make a significant difference, and they are sufficiently significant that you can do this without undermining the fairness of sports. It is, as the Supreme Court often does, it's going to rely upon their views about the legitimacy of medical people in this area. And, we go back, not to make the connection too historic, but recall that Roe versus Wade, way back in 1973, an awful lot of people look at that and say, yes, that was, of course, the case that said that you've got a privacy right to reproductive rights in America. It is in the Constitution. Ultimately, that decision by Justice Blackmun, by a majority of the Supreme Court, wasn't so much a legal opinion. It was a medical opinion. And if you read it, the criticism that an awful lot of people still make about Roe versus Wade, again, no longer the law of the land, overruled by Dobbs after 50 years, was that it was so steeped in the medical status and healthcare of the time that it was almost outside of jurisprudence, outside of the law. And for that very reason, forgive me for going on about this, but in the wake of the Supreme Court's initially even saying there are 3 trimesters and the government has no capacity to regulate abortion in the first trimester, increasing the second and none in the third, within years, the medical authorities came back and said that very bright line test viability is now not clearly as specific as it used to be, and so we've got to have a better test. It once again underscored the nature of the medical reliance of the Supreme Court. I raise all that just because my guess is when it comes to this issue, this Hecox case, and the question of what judges do about this, there will be an awful lot of people saying this is not a legal issue, it's a medical issue having to do with the human body and transgender status and healthcare for it. Those are very complicated issues, right? And so that's the reason why I think this is going to be a fascinating debate that the Supreme Court will have in this Hecox case, and an even more fascinating decision to see how they come down on this.
One of the things that has made me quite angry as this issue has come front and center is that, I will have it come up sometimes on work calls with somebody that doesn't know that I'm transgender. Right. Because of this issue of trans people in sports, I feel like my very identity is on the line for something that I've never cared about. I've never cared about sports at all. Tell me a little bit about why you feel like this does or does not matter? What is the importance of these cases in particular?
Right. They certainly will stand in the end. However, the Supreme Court comes down on this. And right now, you know that in many of these areas, we've got a very conservative Supreme Court, 6-3, down many of these kinds of issues. And so that may not be a perfect predictor, but let's assume for the purposes of the argument that perhaps they find that indeed the states can, in fact, restrict transgender women from participating in these kinds of sporting events. I think it's hugely important because people tend to read the headlines, right? And that in many ways, just like the Scrimeti case, which is, from my view, got to be viewed as a setback for a community that should have the right to make individual choices with families and with youth and with their medical doctors, right? That choice, that capacity to choose, basically taken away, at least in those states. Much the same here. I think about the large statement that the Supreme Court may make in which there can be a blanket ban, again, on transgender women participating in sports. And for that reason, the world is told, number one, that transgender people, transgender women, transgender men, therefore are not entitled to civil rights and human rights. They make that jump from the big ticket issue to the much more specific and inappropriate decision. The other reason why I think it's so very important is what you just said, which is the individual aspect of this. We all have personal things that we do in our lives, and healthcare, medical care, our own bodies, how we understand, how we live inside our skin. I always think about, for myself, for everyone, I believe, that's an incredibly intimate thing, right? And incredibly focused upon who you are as a human being. I am troubled that a government, whether it's the Supreme Court or legislatures out there in all of these cases, are making these decisions for individuals, knowing that every single person, as you just said, you and I may be more or less sports inclined generally, right? That may change the calculus overall. We may not be interested in sports, or we may be hugely interested in sports. It just underscores the individual nature of this. And when you announce a rule in legal trappings that applies to everybody, my concern is that when it gets applied to particular individuals, you lose something dramatic. You lose the individuality of choice. You lose the individuality that should come for every American who celebrates their own personhood inside their own body.
So what I'm really hearing from you then is that for the person that says, I don't think that it's fair to see transgender people playing in sports, I feel like they do have an unfair advantage.
Right.
What I'm hearing from you is you're saying that should be decided by each individual governing agency for that sport, but by the Supreme Court stepping in and making a decision, they're actually, that power is being taken away from them. And so for the person that is worried about, well, I think that this is unfair, what you're saying is this is a very bad way to deal with something, even for somebody that agrees overall with the concept. I think
that's
fair?
Exactly right, because those individual governing agencies for particular sports, where you are in the academic stratosphere, if you will, whether in high school or college or professional sports, as you appropriately opened up the subject here, all of those things are highly specific, right? Even as to bodies that are all different, right? They're all developing. And so I would much rather have not only the experts, if you will, in those particular sports, whether it's lacrosse or swimming or football or cross country, you name the sport. I'd much rather have them wrestle with these issues involving the individual, both transgender athletes and others who participate in those sports, making those decisions. Is that more complicated? You bet it is. Is it easier to have a bright line test, black and white, that says, nope, well, you're not going to do this anymore? Of course it is. But life is not like that, right? Life is full of the gray areas. And I think when we begin to eliminate the possibilities that there may be different circumstances under different conditions, we are not doing a service to anybody.
So for a trans man, a transgender boy, so in other words, assigned female at birth, but that it's then started taking testosterone and is now, what are the concerns there? Because I know the one that I always think of is Mac Baggs, who won twice the Texas championship in women's wrestling.
Right.
And he said, I don't want to wrestle against the women, but because of the way that Texas is structured, they said, well, you are a woman.
Right.
We don't see you as a man, so you cannot wrestle with the men.
Yeah.
And many people I heard be frustrated, assuming that he must have been a transgender woman.
Right.
And he wasn't. He
Right.
was exactly the opposite. He
Right.
said, I don't want to be with this group.
Right.
Is that the concern there as well, or what is the concern now?
Yeah,
with trans
I
men?
think the concern is, again, that kind of issue. If the Supreme Court, in the end, announces very broad rules about this and simply says we're not going to permit anything. If you are transgender, if you're a transgender woman, transgender a male, a boy or a girl, you stay in the sport you were assigned at the time of your birth. They do that kind of a thing, and once again, it eliminates the individual circumstance. That's the concern, right? Mm-hmm. It'll be fascinating to see how the Supreme Court articulates its resolution of the Hecox matter. Again, it's a transgender woman. It wants, obviously, to play. This has to do with in the women's track and cross-country teams. But there will be arguments about all variations on that. And you may get, again, from the dissenters, again, assuming this goes in the way that I suspect it will, you will get probably dissenters describing all the different possibilities here about resolving this case that the majority has simply glossed over. And that's the great concern I have about that situation that you just described. How if people fall within, again, do not in fact identify in the way that we may think in an easy category, and they look at this opinion and they say it sweeps too broadly, what does that mean for me, right? That's the concern, the lack of individual applicability.
I'm Chuck Reynolds, and I started listening to Transcendent because Joe is my friend. I keep listening because I have friends, colleagues, and family members who are part of the LGBTQ community, and I want to better understand their struggles and perspectives. I have become a supporter because I believe Joe and Raya are truly helping to preserve relationships and save lives. Join me in supporting Transcendent. Just go to transcendent.com, click on support, and select the amount you'd like to give each month. It can be as little as $3, and you can cancel at any time.
Are there other issues that are coming up as well that LGBTQ people should be concerned about?
The other major case that's before the Supreme Court is conversion therapy. And it comes out of Colorado. The Colorado legislature there said we're banning this, as many other states across the nation. This has been soundly not only disputed, but rejected by medical authorities who say that conversion therapy not only does not work, but it's also affirmatively destructive. And if you're in like those other situations, the medical authorities are pretty unanimous, not exclusively, but pretty unanimous on this issue. The question is, it's raised in connection with a therapist in Colorado who maintains that her right to pursue her medical field, her psychology, is being impinged upon by Colorado in saying that no one can engage in conversion therapy. She plainly believes, we'll get more exposition of this before the Supreme Court, that it is a legitimate way of addressing whatever the issue may be there. And the Supreme Court now, once again, is going to be deciding whether a state can lawfully prohibit medical providers from doing that. That also a huge, big-ticket issue. I wonder, again, I would feel much better if, in this case especially, the medical authorities were the ones who make those decisions. But again, our judges are doing it because, in part, the legislatures are maybe not as clear as they should be, and we turn to the Supreme Court for all of these decisions, right? Privacy issues, body issues, individual rights issues. We need, I think, in America to recognize that judges, just because you're a judge, just because you're a lawyer, you may not have the monopoly on insight in these areas, and that humility's got to come.
For the skeptic that's listening right now, wondering, and they say, okay, well, you just said here in the issue of sports, we should put it back to the governing agencies for those individual sports. Sure. So they may say, what about the same thing right now? Shouldn't we put that back? Not have the Supreme Court say, look, we're not going to say that there should be a ban. We'll let them decide that specifically, and let's open it up. My understanding is that up until now, there has been a ban legally that you are not allowed to practice conversion therapy, which I, of course, think is good because we've seen the pain that has caused for people. Yes. But for the person that's skeptical, that says, well, we just made the argument that it should go back to the governing agencies. What do you feel about that in this case? Does that not apply now, or what's the difference?
Right. I think the answer is depending upon how you define the governing entities, I always look to people who know what they're talking about, right? The scientists, the experts, the people who know about the facts. Here, I would say that unlike the other situation, the other case we're talking about, here you do have a fair amount of unanimity when it comes to these kinds of things. And so if you defer to them, you're basically, I think, going to come to the right result. And that's not to say that the result dictates your process, but just that unlike some of those other situations, here you do have a great deal of unanimity in the medical community. And especially when it comes to these notions that doctors have articulated, that there can be affirmative harm, a real affirmative harm in doing this. That, I think, is something the government is obliged to protect against.
So there's a lot to be worried about and concerned about, and many of our listeners have wrote in talking about how they feel very nervous in our current political situation here in the United States. So for listeners who don't see themselves as activists, what are some simple, practical ways that they can help protect rights in their own communities?
Sure. I think that the notion that there is education out there that should be a part, and I'm not even talking about formal education. Certainly in our schools, public schools, I would endorse that. But generally in the communities, get together, having forums to talk about these very difficult issues, tell people that you will probably hear things that you may not agree with. That's great. That's what America is all about. And simply provide information about, number one, what the cases are about, what the issues are about, what medical authorities say, what they don't say, and just that basic information providing, that education function, I think can be huge. And then the other piece of it, of course, is I'm a big advocate for wherever you come down, whatever side you come down on these very difficult and controversial issues, let people know about it. If it's in your state legislature, go there and be a part of a lobby day. Go there and talk to your legislators about how strongly you feel. And again, invoking what we're chatting about right here, putting a personal face on the issue. It's very easy to talk about these things when you think about an article that's presented in a journal of even medical authorities. If there's a human being who is there who can articulate how this has impacted me, that I think has a tremendous impact upon legislators, can be, again, county executives, can be local municipal authorities, can be governors, can be senators, can be members of the House of Representatives, putting that personal face in it, writing to them, calling them, and actually being there in person and saying, I would like to talk to you to let you know how much this means to me. I think those things can have a huge impact.
How powerful really is it to call a state legislator or someone else that you think might be a school board member? How powerful is that?
The answer is it depends upon the legislator. I think all of them take records and make notes about who is called in, where they fall on a particular issue. That's these that we're talking about and others. They always record it. They always make a note of it. I do believe that if they hear from their constituencies and they are very one-sided on any particular issue, and their staff comes forward and says, listen, we've been taking phone calls, we've been getting postcards and letters for the past 6 months, and 95% of your constituents feel this way, I think that can have a huge impact. If, in fact, it's much more divided, then that's when the personal engagement can be much more important. I also believe in one other small thing, and that is the calls are important, the emails are important. If you decide you want to write an individual letter, I'm a big advocate of doing the very old-fashioned way. Pull out an envelope, get a stamp, and get a piece of paper and write, "Dear Senator, dear Congressman, dear State Representative, I know that you're addressing this particular bill. I want to tell you who I am. I want to give you 3 sentences about my experience in life, and I want to tell you how important it is that you vote in this way or that way." Signed, whoever you're writing. I think that can have a huge impact. A handwritten letter showing up in the chambers, in the office of that elected representative.
Even more than a phone call, even more than sometimes even showing up.
I believe that. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. I believe that. Yes. Yeah. Showing up is huge. I think that may be a little bit even more than a letter. If you can't go to your state house, you can't go to Washington, D.C., I think a letter is a very, very powerful way of communicating that. Again, a handwritten letter, again, it can be typed also. Word perfect and word shows how old I am, I guess. But you can do those things as well. But I think the notion of somebody who sat down and it was important enough to them to sit down at their kitchen table and write a letter, I think that's huge.
What role can faith communities play in supporting legal protections without feeling like they're betraying their beliefs?
Yes, absolutely. We know that religion and faith issues are very much on the docket of this Supreme Court, and therefore they're in the dockets of lower courts as well. District courts, federal district courts, appeals courts. Religion under the First Amendment is huge. We know that there are 2 provisions of that First Amendment. It says government makes no laws establishing religion. You can't create and compel people inside government offices to engage in a certain kind of faith. Likewise, we're not going to inhibit your expression of religion, right? That's the other piece of this. Faith communities can do 2 things. They can affirm those fundamental notions that we do, in fact, want a separation of church and state. We don't want our particular faith, whether you are a Jew, a Hindu, a Muslim, a Sikh, a Christian, a Buddhist, whoever you are, we don't want our religion created inside the government. You can do that. And second, we also want the government not to tell us how to exercise our faith as a Jew, as a Sikh, as a Jain, as a Muslim, as a Christian. Do not become involved in telling us and restricting us. And both of those things, I think, again, they come right from the Constitution. They should also be a part of your letters and your individual visits. The faith community can have a huge impact. Again, somebody sits down in front of a legislator who says, "I'm a member of the Sikh faith. I am a Hindu. I am a Jew. And this is how strongly I feel about government not doing this and doing this in another area."
We've had so many people out there saying, "What can we do? What can we do?" And I think the advice you're giving them right here is really critical. And it is one thing they can do. If it's one thing that they could do this week to protect their LGBTQ plus rights, what would you tell them?
I would tell them to be not just present in the community. I know it's an easy thing to say, but when given opportunities, even for people who may sit down and say, as we have talked here, that on some of these issues that are controversial, someone sits down and says, "You know what, I disagree with you." The answer is yes. We live in America where you can agree. Can we sit down and talk civilly to each other? And can we have that exchange? I will listen to you, and you will listen to me. And maybe if we've got a half an hour, we can get somewhere in understanding each other. I think that's huge. And I think it also sends the message that the LGBTQIA community, like every other positive thinking community that wants what's good for all Americans, is open to that kind of expression and wants to have it. I think that is huge.
Good. Yes. And where can families go to find reliable legal resources or especially low-cost legal help if they're going through an issue that you've touched on here? Maybe they've got somebody in the family that's transitioning, maybe especially youth,
right?
Or they're touching on the sports issue or conversion therapy. Where can they go for legal help?
A number of different opportunities. I do all of my legal work pro bono, and it has from time to time been involved with LGBTQIA issues, particularly in the academic area. There are attorneys out there who normally get paid, and they certainly will be happy to take those cases on, but there are some of them also who will say, "You know what, this is so important to me regardless of who they are, where they come from, that I will take these on pro bono. It's more difficult to find them out there, but you can do so. There are also some great agencies out there in every single state in the union. I happen to work for, again, there are other variations on this. I work for a legal aid society in Milwaukee. Every single major city has a legal aid society of some kind or some name like that. They do housing work, they do employment work, they do academic work, including as it impacts the LGBTQIA community. There are also groups called Legal Action of Tennessee, of Idaho, any names like that. They are designed, they are nonprofit entities that are there. They're understaffed, as you can well imagine. They don't have huge resources, but they do have the opportunities. They do want to hear from you, and they're open to be presented with cases that should be at least addressed by them and maybe litigated in court.
For parents listening who worry about their LGBTQ child, their safety, or the situation, maybe they're being harassed of some type or bullied, what legal documents or protections should they put in place today?
Mm-hmm. This is and again, like all the others, this is a tremendous challenge. Why? Because, of course, most of that in an academic setting, it often happens, can happen in other places, in sports and other things outside the classroom. But one of the things that I always think about, especially when it comes to bullying, and I've frankly addressed some of these issues in some local school districts in the past several years, there are petitions that can and should be made to local school boards to address bullying, to address those issues. Under various federal rules and regulations, especially if they're accepting federal monies, there are obligations of school districts and school boards to undertake this issue. How? By doing for their staff, for their teachers, for the people who are responsible for students, doing bullying responsive training. How it is you address this? How do you number one, create an environment where young people and people who are older in an educational setting feel comfortable coming forward and saying, I am on the receiving end of bullying, some other form of discrimination. There are obligations of those entities to put mechanisms in place to investigate those, to respond to those, to respond in a way that's very specific. If you've got a particular instance with particular individuals who are engaged in this kind of behavior, responding to that through the professionals who know how to do that. It is less document related and more a matter of getting to, again, your school board, especially principals, especially guidance counselors, and saying, you know what, this is happening. You have an obligation to take care of my son, my daughter, the person in my family who is attending school here, and I am expecting that you respond to this in some way.
Jim, you have just filled us with an amazing amount of information. In just a little bit, we've just touched the surface here. There are so many things that are happening legally that have happened in the past and are pressuring us right now for the immediate future. And there's a lot. We could talk for hours.
We could talk for hours. Unfortunately, I could do that, right, and continue this for hours and hours. And it underscores the point I made perhaps implicitly just a moment or so ago. We have an obligation in this very challenging time in these United States and arguably around the world to be informed and to be educated. And that's always been true for 250 years of this nation, but especially now when these issues are percolating up for the LGBTQIA community, but for all of us concerned about civil rights, you got to be informed. And you have to spend some extra time reading, going to reliable news sources, talking to people who know what they're talking about, and getting informed so that when you have these kinds of conversations, whether they're confrontational or not, you are doing that from a base of knowledge and information. And that's what I think you're doing so very well on this podcast, providing this kind of information, not just from me, but from every one of your guests who comes on, hopefully giving them some animation, some inspiration based upon knowledge.
Are there any important topics that we have not asked you about or questions that we need to get? We don't have a lot of time left, but anything else that's really critical to add in here?
I think consistent with your overall questions, talk about the future, right? We talk a lot about the present, and even I talk about the coming term. And within 12 months, we're going to have decisions on all these things. We're people, we have longevity here that's far beyond what our founding fathers had. We need to think about today and tomorrow, yes, and there are crises that happens in our lives right now and in our families. We also need to think about what happens 5 years from now. Where will I be in 5 years from now? Where will I be 10 years from now? What are my expectations about my family relationship, my relationship with other people? And what can I do now to inform myself? To also give myself the skills that I can continue to be an advocate in that future. It is unknown. I know that's a very, very wishy-washy kind of a commission, but I always think about where I am right now and prompt myself, to ask, where will I be? Where will I be in the future? And how can I do things now in the work that I do, in the speaking that I do, in the education that I and all of your listeners and you do? How can I impact not only my future, but a generation that's coming up right behind me?
Well, in my opinion, you've already had a lot of impact. Just getting the word out there and reaching out to so many people means a lot. And it gives people, I think, a sense of optimism for the future, knowing that we're always going to be addressing these things. And yes, there'll be steps forward and there'll be steps back, and that'll continue. But let's just hope there's more steps forward.
Absolutely. And you keep that in mind. And again, all of us, we are optimistic about the future, even in times of challenge, as you just said. Take that optimism and scream from the mountaintops, right? And be an advocate and be forceful and be human.
And in that area, talking about the future, we hope there's an opportunity to have you back again sometime.
I would be honored and delighted, as I am right now. Always. You invite me, I am here.
Thank you. And one thing that will always be optimistic is this podcast. That's why we're grateful to have you here listening, coming back week after week for different messages of positivity of how we can strengthen our relationships.
And if there's one thing you can do to help us, we ask you to share this with someone else. If you've heard something in this podcast that you feel is critical and someone else needs to hear it, take the time, please, to share it with them. We thank you for anything that you could do to help us spread the word. And if you have any comments or thoughts with us, you can always contact us at transdescended@gmail.com. And as I say, we read every one. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Jim, thank you so much for joining us here today. It was a pleasure to have you.
Pleasure to be on this show. And anytime you invite me back, I am right here.
And with that, we'll see you Monday.
It's not coming to me, and it's a dad joke, but I'm just not getting it right here. So,
I was at a conference this last weekend, and I told some stupid dad joke. The woman across the table from me just stared at me, and she said,
Right.
"Why do I always get paired with people that tell the stupid jokes?"